Hello, and welcome to the 7 Deadly E&O Sins in Commercial Marine. I'm your host for this webinar, Ian Greenway. One of the great things about a commercial marine insurance policy is you're effectively given a blank sheet of paper onto which you can create a policy that fits the client. One of the worst things about a marine insurance policy is you're given a blank sheet of paper and you have to create a policy that reacts to the exposures of your client. So what we're going to do in this webinar is walk you through 7 E&O claims. One of them is a near miss, but the other 6 are actual E&O claims that happened to an agent or a broker and were brought to our office, often after the claim had happened, to try and help the agent out of trouble. It's a lot easier to keep you out of trouble than it is to get you out of trouble. So we'll use these as an example of what can go wrong, and we'll show you how to plug those gaps. The first claim came from an engine repair company near Jacksonville, Florida. They were on the St. Johns River and did about 50% of their work on boat, marine engines, and about 50% on dry, things like generators and other similar engines. They'd purchased through their agent 2 separate policies: a monoline GL from a typical property casualty company, and a marina operator's legal liability with a P&I endorsement, again from a separate company. They'd been repairing a boat for about a week and then returned it to the owner late on a Friday afternoon. The owner had a guest on board and took it away from the premises of the engine repair shop late in the afternoon. About half an hour after that, the boat exploded, killing one person and critically injuring the second. So, of course, the agent reports the claim initially to the GL carrier because of a bodily injury and property damage. And the GL carrier pointed at the watercraft exclusion in their policy. Now, I'm going to ignore for this purpose anything to do with aircraft or auto, but this is how it reads: bodily injury or property damage arising out of the ownership, maintenance, use or entrustment to others of any watercraft owned, operated by or rented or loaned to any insured. Use includes operation and loading or unloading. The GL carrier, rightly or wrongly, denied the claim based on that exclusion because the engine repair company had actually operated the vessel. They took it out on a test drive. After you repair the engine, that's a very common thing to do. They weren't operating the vessel at the time of the explosion. It had been returned to the owner at that point. So the marina operator's legal liability, which is a care, custody, control policy, and the P&I for the marina, for the engine repair shop, didn't apply. And the GL carrier denied the claim. I think it would have been tough for them to do so if they'd written a package policy, including the GL, the marina operators, and the P&I all in one go, but because it was monoline GL, they got away with it. I will tell you, I think this is wrong. I don't think that they should have been taking premium for a boat engine repair and then denying the product's completed operations claim. But if you look at the strict wording of the standard GL form, the ISO form, that is how it's written. It doesn't say owned or operating the vessel. It says owned or operated the vessel, past tense. How do you overcome this? Well, very simple. Either remove that MGL exclusion for watercraft or get the carrier to confirm in writing that they're not using it to deny that product's completed operations coverage. Many marine companies will do just that. And that makes the claim move to the marine package rather than stand alone. I can't sit here and tell you how Ian would like the wordings to be read. What I can only tell you is how they are being read. And I will tell you that there are carriers out there today using this exclusion to deny marine products completed operation type claims in a monoline GL policy. The second case is a marine engineering company. Their headquarters was in Texas. They had a branch in Florida. And again, the problem largely arose because they had two separate policies in force. They'd purchased workers' comp in Texas from a Texas domiciled company and a separate workers' comp in Florida for the Florida office. They had Longshore endorsements on both policies, but the Longshore endorsement in Texas just covered Texas, and the Longshore policy in Florida just covered Florida. They sent an employee to work in Alabama for 2 to 3 days, and he was injured whilst there. Again, both policies had the standard Longshore coverage that only provides coverage in the listed state. And it's listed in the Longshore endorsement, not in the 3A or 3C. 3C has nothing to do with Longshore. Neither, for that matter, does 3A. And because Texas was the only location listed on the Texas policy declined. Because Florida was the only location listed on the Longshore endorsement on the Florida policy declined. And the Alabama injury dropped between the two policies. It's very dangerous to have multiple Longshore policies on multiple different states. You really want one Longshore policy that covers you everywhere a client can work. A few companies will give you a Longshore endorsement that says any state. Some will say something like any state listed in 3A or 3C, which is typically everything except the monopolistic states. But at a minimum, you should list every state where the insured could work. Not should work, but could work. If you have an insured, let's say, based in Texas, they'll work in Louisiana at a heartbeat and they won't tell you. And they may go over to Mississippi and Alabama. Those Gulf Coast businesses in particular will transit from state to state very quickly and very easily without involving you. So you should, at a minimum, have all those 4 Gulf states listed, and maybe Florida as well if their business ever brings them to Florida. If they're in San Diego, California, the likelihood of them jumping out of state is probably a little bit less. But if, let's say, they're in Rhode Island, they're probably going to work in 3 or 4 surrounding states instantly. Ask the question, where could you work of your client? And make sure all those states are listed in the Longshore endorsement. Number 3 is a towboat operator. It's towing a third-party barge with cargo aboard and had 2 policies in force, a hull with the collision and towers liability built into the hull policy, which is the traditional way of doing it. Not the way everybody does it, but it's certainly the traditional way of doing it. And then a P&I policy which included cargo legal liability. Again, it's important here to note that there are 2 different carriers involved. Here, the third-party barge sunk whilst it was in tow and the cargo was destroyed. The P&I policy with cargo legal liability only covers cargo on owned vessels. And because this was a third-party barge, it did not cover it. But the hull paid in this case, and this is why it was a near miss. The collision and towers coverage in the hull form included the damage to third-party cargo on a third-party barge. That was very unusual. It took a lot of digging into the policy to actually find and trigger the coverage. But many of the collision and towers liability forms out there do not include this cargo liability when it's on a third-party vessel. Similarly, the P&I cargo doesn't cover on third-party vessels because it's designed for damage to the cargo on your own vessels. This is a very narrow set of circumstances, but it's an important one because many towboats will tow third-party barges, and those barges could have millions of dollars of equipment or cargo on board. You've got to make sure that your collision and towers form gives the coverage for cargo on third-party vessels. The fourth claim comes out of a boat dealer. The coverage in force was a standard marine general liability boat dealers package program, a pretty standard marine carrier. You think that that would cover everything the boat dealer would need. They sold this new boat to a third party, and then about 18 months later, it catches fire at the dock and is pretty well completely destroyed. There was no bodily injury to anybody, or third-party property damage. They managed to push it away from the dock. So really the claim was just for the value of the boat. Just before the sale of the boat, the dealer had installed an air conditioner, and the fire causation experts had traced the cause of the fire to the faulty wiring connecting that air conditioner to the boat's power. In fact, what was missing was a little rubber grommet when the wiring passed through a bulkhead. And over the 18 months of the vessel being used, that wire had shorted out and sparked the fire. Because that air conditioner was part of the boat for sale, your product or your work kicked in as an exclusion under the marine general liability. Your goods or products other than any real property manufactured, sold, handled, distributed or disposed by you or others trading in your name are excluded from coverage. Now, I would have argued that perhaps the air conditioner and the wiring of the air conditioner was the product, but the fact is the boat dealer sold the whole boat, including the air conditioner, as one package deal. So it became their product, and the destruction of the boat wasn't covered accordingly. How do you overcome this? You can negotiate with your underwriters to remove or explain to the client that they have no coverage in writing. You need to remove that limitation on what is the product that is of the boat dealer. So in other words, the air conditioner or even the wiring of the air conditioner could have been the boat dealer's product, but not the whole boat, because that was manufactured by somebody else. When you talk to 5 different carriers on this, 4 of them have solutions, probably 2 different solutions in some cases. But it really is critical that you talk to your carrier and say, how do I stop this type of claim happening? In the non-marine world, people who repair and service autos or RV have an auto garage type policy that covers this. But in the marine world, we don't have a standard way of covering adaptations, improvements that we do to a vessel before we sell it. This happened to be a new vessel, but it could just as easily be a used one. And the dealer is usually the deep pocket to go after in that case. Number 5 comes from a tugboat operator. They purchased hull, collision and towers liability to $1.2 million on the tug. They had a whole fleet of tugs. This was just one of them. They covered a separate P&I policy for a $1 million limit. And then they bought an excess monoline P&I, again with a separate carrier, using the American Institute excess clauses. And it's really important here to see that that's an excess monoline P&I. This wasn't an umbrella policy or any other form of multiple excess. It was a monoline P&I because that's where they felt the exposure was. They collided with a cruise ship. This photograph is actually just a tug pushing a cruise ship because we didn't have a picture of the collision, but they collided with a cruise ship. Again, about $5 million of damage to the cruise ship, but no bodily injury or third-party property damage. So we start with the collision liability or collision and towers liability under the hull policy. And the hull policy pays up to the limit of that hull policy in addition to the damage to the tugboat for damage to the cruise ship. So you get $1.2 million worth of coverage under the hull policy. The P&I policy has only got $1 million limit, and it only covers collision and towers liability that's below that $1 million limit. In other words, the gap between the collision and towers and the P&I limit. In this case, the hull limit is bigger than the P&I, so the primary P&I policy pays nothing. Now remember I said that they had a monoline excess P&I policy, and because the primary didn't pay anything, neither did the excess. Total coverage in force, just $1.2 million, even though they had a $10 million program. The American Institute Excess Liability Clauses allows you to schedule an underlying collision and towers liability as well as underlying P&I. Now, if the whole policy had only been $500,000, you wouldn't have needed it because that primary P&I would have picked up and then the excess would have picked up. But because the insured vessel value was over the $1 million, there is no gap to trigger that primary policy. So to trigger coverage, you need to add that excess collision and towers liability. Once you do, it's simple. And the worst part about it is that it doesn't cost anything to add it. I don't know anybody in the market that's going to charge you more to add excess collision and towers excess of $1.2 million in your excess policy. In fact, if that number had been bigger, you might even get a discount because you've got a higher attachment than the standard $1 million you'd expect. List the collision and towers liability in the excess policy as an underlying if the hull value is equal to or greater than the P&I limit. Number 6 was an independent welder working on a mega yacht. He had marine general liability for $1 million in force. Typical, most yards require you to come in and have at least $1 million. This was a one-man business. Now, he did have some longshore insurance, but he wasn't injured, so that's not really relevant to this particular claim. He was working on a mega yacht just before delivery. It's about a $7 million vessel. There was nobody else on board. There was no fire watch. When he was doing some tack welding on a place where he'd done some prior welding. What he wasn't aware is that somebody put insulation behind that panel since the time he worked on it before, and his weld set that insulation alight and basically destroyed the yacht. Because he was the only person on board at that moment of time, the yacht was determined to be in the care, custody, control of the welder. So the care, custody, control exclusion, personal property in the care, custody, control of the insured, in the MGL policy came into play and the carrier denied the claim. There are no endorsements on this policy, just a straightforward, no relevant endorsements, straightforward MGL monoline policy. He didn't have what is called ship repairer's legal liability. That's that care, custody, control coverage that would have given him coverage for the vessel. And clearly with a $7 million yacht basically destroyed, his limit was inadequate at $1 million. Our seventh and final claim arose out of a shipyard on a river. They had a marine general liability and ship repairers policy in force. They also had a hull and P&I policy, marine liability policy, for the workboats, including crew. Again, an explosion kills one and injures a second person. And because the employee worked part-time on the vessel, he claimed to be a crewman, particularly because that's where the coverage existed. But after some debate by the courts, they did rule him to be a longshoreman because his predominant job was repairing vessels, not acting as a crewman. There's a trigger in here of less than 30% of your time on board a vessel or identifiable fleet of vessel. And this person spent about only 15% of his time acting as crew and was not acting as a crewman when the vessel exploded. This was a third-party vessel that exploded. Here's the problem. There was no longshore in force. So the guardian of a minor dependent of the deceased, child of the deceased, sued the agent for not requiring the insured to purchase Longshore coverage. The insured had been offered Longshore, said complete this application and return it, but they never did it. And the agent never pushed it, and they never purchased Longshore. I don't know what was in the mind of the client at that point, but bear in mind, this wasn't the shipyard suing their agent. This was the guardian of the minor dependent of the employee who was killed, the child of the employee. We can't stop them suing. So how do you overcome all these? In your general liability policy, you need to deal with the watercraft exclusion. You need to add a care, custody, and control coverage. Marine operators' legal liability, ship repairers' legal liability, terminal operators' legal liability, whatever it is, in the marine world we have other people's product in our care, custody, control, and we need that coverage. And particularly for the boat dealer, anybody that's buying and selling vessels or vessel parts, you either need to cure or explain that your product, your work exclusion, so that they recognize that damage to that vessel may not be covered if it's determined that that was their product. Collision and towers liability. Schedule it as an underlying on the excess if the hull limit is greater than the primary P&I. Now, some carriers do move the collision and towers to the P&I policy, and that is one way to overcome this. I don't think it's a great way because you lose some coverage in that force. But for vessels over that typical $1 million primary P&I limit, look out, make sure you've structured it properly. Verify somehow you're getting that cargo coverage, cargo legal liability, on non-owned vessels. Is it under the collision and towers liability? Could you maybe add the coverage to a cargo legal liability, including it to non-owned? I think some underwriters might be prepared to do it, but somehow you need to block that coverage, find that coverage in one of the policies. Longshore. Clearly you always want to add a Longshore endorsement to work comp policy or place monoline Longshore. Either way works. Monoline Longshore might be slightly better because you can get national coverage very easily. The work comp policies has some limitations, particularly in monopolistic states. In that Longshore endorsement, if you're going the traditional route, list all states which the insurer could possibly work. If your carrier will give you an all states type of endorsement, that's great, but again, often that'll exclude the monopolistic states. I'm not too worried about some of them, but Washington State and Ohio can have a lot of marine work there, so that could be a real issue if you haven't got Longshore coverage there. And as my example in the shipyard is concerned, always cover Longshore. Make sure the client's bought Longshore or politely walk away from the account. There's just no other way of dealing with this. Remember, in that last case, it wasn't the client that's suing. It was the guardian of a child of the employee that was injured. So it was 2 steps away, but they still had the right to sue. Remember that marine insurance policy is a blank sheet of paper, and you have to design the policy to fit your client. I'll return you now to the studio, and thank you for attending.